I recently realized that some bad people punish themselves throughout their lives and remain unhappy. My ex-wife pursued her insidious goal and cheated on me throughout our marriage. It was hard to accept, but it's easier to accept that sooner or later, every cheater will pay for their actions in the most terrible way. Entering the restaurant, I scanned the room until my gaze settled on my ex-wife, seated at a corner table, her husband conspicuously absent. A decade had passed since our divorce, yet being in her presence still stirred unease within me. Contemplating whether to engage with her, I ultimately resolved to proceed, though with a lingering sense of apprehension. Despite the passage of time, my ex-wife maintained her allure, though the years had left their mark. Her evident nervousness mirrored my own inner turmoil, hearkening back to the day my world crumbled with the collapse of our marriage. It had taken extensive therapy to find my footing again, the journey beginning at the medical clinic. "Mr. Williams, your report is ready," the receptionist announced, interrupting my reverie. Lost in my thoughts, I almost missed her call, grappling with the lingering despair that seemed unshakable. Retrieving the envelope containing the report, a wave of dread washed over me. Despite its innocuous appearance bearing only my name, Justin Williams, I knew its contents held the potential to upend my life once more. Dazed, I crossed the street to a park and located an isolated bench. Unaware of the drizzle or the bench's dampness, my attention was solely on the envelope. With trembling hands, I tore it open. Though the report contained many unfamiliar terms, what stood out to me was that it was a DNA test involving 4 individuals: myself, my wife Amber, my daughter Jennifer, and my son Todd. It took several attempts to grasp the report's message. It revealed that my children were biologically related to their mother and shared the same father. But that father wasn't me. Overwhelmed, I broke down in tears. After 17 years of marriage, discovering that my life was built on deceit was unbearable. I was lost, unsure of what to do or think. Our marriage had begun under unusual circumstances. Amber had dated Jimmy Swanson throughout high school, someone I'd considered a decent guy. He'd been the star quarterback, though our football team wasn't particularly successful. I knew this well, having played as the starting middle linebacker for 3 years after initially being a substitute due to our school's small size, which required almost all players to suit up. In the initial 3 years, our team only managed to secure victory in a total of 5 games. However, during my final year, inexplicably, we achieved a 6-2 record and clinched the regional championship with a score of 9-7. Despite Jimmy's poor performance that day, our defense stepped up significantly. Unfortunately, our season came to an abrupt end when we suffered a crushing defeat in the divisional round. Jimmy and Amber had been in a relationship for as long as I could recall. However, something occurred, leading to their breakup a couple of weeks before graduation. Subsequently, Jimmy departed the town to enlist in the military. He would occasionally return until finally leaving the army after 9 years and resettling in the area permanently. After the graduation ceremony, I found myself at one of our high school graduation parties when I unexpectedly bumped into Amber. Surprisingly, she started a conversation with me, and I didn't even notice how we were already having sex. I saw this meeting as a unique opportunity, and it seemed quite natural to take advantage of it. Initially, I assumed that our relationship would develop in this way. However, the reality turned out to be completely different than I expected. 4 weeks after our affair, Amber caught up with me at the pizza shack. She disclosed that she was expecting, and I was the father. It was another instance where I found myself at a loss for thoughts, actions, or words. Despite the turmoil, tears didn't come. Instead, I sought solace in confiding with my father. It marked one of the toughest conversations I've ever had with him. Naturally, he expressed his disappointment yet urged me to act honorably. Hence, we decided to marry. Despite being just 18, Amber preferred to keep her pregnancy a secret from her parents until after the wedding. My father handled the arrangements, and within 2 days, we eloped to a neighboring state. Amber informed her parents during our honeymoon, spent in a modest Best Western hotel for 3 days. While their initial reaction was far from jubilant, they swiftly adjusted to the new reality. Amber's parents, Fred and Janice Burton, epitomized conservative values stemming from their affluent background. Despite their wealth, they held steadfast to traditional principles and strove to instill a strong work ethic in their children. Fred served as a vice president at a bank, while Janice tended to their household as a stay-at-home mother. Among their 3 children, Julie, Sarah, and the youngest, Amber, tradition was paramount. It took some time, but eventually the Burtons grew to accept the idea of our marriage and began to warm up to me. Over the years, I developed a close bond with Amber's parents, particularly with Fred, who often expressed that he saw me as the son he never had. So it was devastating when Mr. and Mrs. Burton tragically passed away in a car exceeding 5 years after our wedding. My marriage with Amber wasn't always smooth sailing. She could be temperamental and demanding. When displeased with me, she didn't hesitate to withhold intimacy. Our sexual encounters were infrequent, occurring only once or twice a week on average, and during times of conflict, we could go weeks without any physical intimacy. Many might question why I tolerated this behavior. To be candid, I was quite naive and deeply in love. Marrying at a young age and having limited prior sexual experiences, I assumed this was normal, believing that Amber loved me in her own unique way. Nonetheless, there were moments when I reached my breaking point and broached the topic of divorce, after which things would improve temporarily. Before tying the knot, I had been admitted to Florida State University. However, those plans changed, and I opted for a local college pursuing a degree in business administration and marketing. To support myself financially, I joined my father's mail-order business, which he had established and grown into a successful enterprise. His company specialized in selling upscale branded camping and fishing gear. I began at the bottom, but my father's payments sustained us. Amber held off on working until Todd was old enough for preschool. Then she took up a real estate sales job. However, it seemed more like a pastime for her, given that her yearly earnings never exceeded $11,000. She lacked the drive to excel, and I was the one covering all expenses, advancing in my father's company each year. Sitting on the bench, it dawned on me that I had been deceived years ago. It was evident to me now that Jimmy Swanson was the biological father of my children. I wondered why Amber chose to stay with me despite this revelation. While I could understand her reluctance due to societal judgment, especially from her parents, the decision to have another child with Jimmy 3 years later was devastating. There had to be more to the situation than I was aware of. "Are you okay?" A voice interrupted my thoughts. Looking up, I saw a policeman in a raincoat identified as Officer Sullivan. He observed me for a moment before sitting down beside me. "Would you like to talk about it?" he asked, his arm resting on the back of the bench. "Sometimes sharing your troubles can be helpful. At the very least, it won't hurt." After a moment's consideration, I thought, why not? I needed to confide in someone. So why not a stranger? As I wiped my eyes, I proceeded to recount to Officer Sullivan the painful revelation of my wife's infidelity and the unsettling truth that my 2 children weren't biologically mine. "Wow," he murmured, shaking his head slowly. And here I thought my ex-wife was the most heartless person alive. After our divorce, I found out she'd been cheating on me since our wedding day. She was discreet, but whenever she fancied someone, she'd sleep with them. I was married to her for 5 years before I caught on, walking in on her with a detective from my own precinct. Caught them in the act, mid-coitus. That sleazy Detective Peterson even tried to escape through the window. I grabbed him by the hair, dragged him back in, and broke his nose on the floor. Blood everywhere, Peterson writhing in pain. And there she was, my wife, sitting on the bed with a smirk. That's when I knew I had to leave before I did something drastic. "What happened then?" I inquired, momentarily diverted from my own anguish. I called my captain, explained what had happened, and he sent officers to take care of both me and Peterson. I was swiftly transferred to another precinct across town until things cooled down while they dealt with Peterson. They dealt with him. How? After the dust settled, my wife had fled town with a cashier's check for all our money. Peterson was desk-bound, and I faced no charges. Turns out my captain had a word with the bank manager the day after my encounter with Peterson. My wife didn't realize the check wasn't signed, too focused on escaping, because my colleagues had warned her I was after her with my service weapon. She spent weeks trying to get it signed, but our accounts were frozen by then. Peterson resigned a month later when he realized the blue wall had turned against him. I divorced my wife, ensuring she'd have to fight for every cent. Last I heard, she was in California with her ilk. The officer's narrative didn't do much to alleviate my pain, but it did provide a slight outlet. "Let me give you some straightforward advice," Officer Sullivan interjected abruptly. "Don't do anything rash. I understand you might feel like harming your wife or yourself. Resist that urge. With time and distance, most emotional wounds will heal." After Officer Sullivan departed, I pondered his words. I concluded that I wasn't ready to confront Amber in my current emotional state. My father had been urging me to visit several manufacturers in the Midwest, suppliers of much of our camping gear. I had been postponing the trip until spring to avoid the harsh winter conditions. However, I now resolved to embark on that journey. I phoned my father, made my way home, and felt relieved that Amber wasn't present. Swiftly, I packed a bag, dialed Amber's cell, and luck was on my side once more as it went to voicemail. Leaving a message about an unspecified business trip, I doubted she'd care, and I was proven right when she didn't call until the third day, which I ignored. Upon returning home, I had calmed down and reflected deeply. It was evident our marriage was finished. Though I was still immensely hurt, I refused to show it. Entering the house, I heard Amber in the den. When she attempted to kiss me, I rebuffed her. "We need to talk," I announced, grabbing a beer from the fridge and sitting at the kitchen table. "Okay," she responded cautiously. "What about?" "I want a divorce." She gazed at me for a while before signing. "Well, it doesn't matter anymore. I suppose you found out about Jimmy and me. I had a feeling you might, given your sudden business trip." "I also discovered Jennifer and Todd aren't my kids," I retorted. Her complexion paled slightly, but then a smirk spread across her face. "I'm sorry you found out, but it's irrelevant now." My eyes widened, and I shook my head in disbelief. "I'm at a loss for words after what you just revealed. Are you remorseful for getting caught? Regretful about your affair with Jimmy and the resulting pregnancies? Or are you simply sorry that I uncovered your deceit? Is it remorse over my naive love for you? What exactly are you sorry for?" Amber showed no signs of shame. "No, I'm only sorry you found out about the children. My plan was to divorce you after my 35th birthday next week. I planned to inform you that I no longer loved you. Then after some time, I would pursue a relationship with Jimmy, eventually marrying him. Over time, I hoped the children would accept him as their stepfather, and when they were older, I would reveal his true paternity." "What's significant about your 35th birthday?" I asked, still struggling to comprehend. "I never mentioned it, but my grandparents established separate trusts for my sister and me, each worth $7 million. However, the condition was that we had to marry by 25 and remain married by 35 to gain full access to the funds. At 35, the trusts become ours with no strings attached. My sisters are older and moved away after getting married. I asked them to keep the trust secret to avoid any complications in our relationship, and they agreed." "Why didn't you marry Jimmy then?" "Because my grandparents were very traditional. According to the trust terms, my parents had to approve of my spouse. My father particularly dislikes Jimmy. Knowing that our parents were friends with yours, I believed they would accept you without objection." I seethed with rage internally. Amber had squandered 17 years of my life, deprived me of my children, and deceived everyone solely to inherit her grandparents' money. She was truly heartless. I yearned to lash out at her, but I understood that resorting to violence would only backfire. During my absence, I had extensively researched divorce proceedings and knew that aggression would yield the opposite of my desired outcome. "Well, Amber, congratulations on achieving your objective," I said with disdain. "Even if I initiated divorce proceedings tomorrow, we wouldn't be legally separated before your 35th birthday. You truly are a heartless woman." Amber simply smirked in response. Despite the repercussions, I felt an overwhelming urge to confront her physically. It required all my self-control to restrain myself. "Since you've proven to be unfaithful and deceitful, I will initiate divorce proceedings tomorrow," I stated as calmly as possible. "If hurling insults makes you feel better, Justin, by all means," Amber retorted, rolling her eyes. "But let's try to handle this with some civility. A swift and discreet divorce would benefit everyone involved." I stepped closer to her, seething with anger, and uttered, "Screw you," before spitting in her direction. "You can despise me as much as you want," she smirked once more. "I'm going to marry Jimmy, and there's nothing you can do about it. Besides, we need to consider the children." "What about them?" I inquired. "You're not going to announce to the world that you're not their biological father, are you?" Amber replied, sounding slightly uncertain. "You wouldn't want everyone to know you've been cuckolded, would you?" I chuckled at this revelation. I suppose by the traditional definition of cuckold, I fit the bill, originating from the behavior of cuckoo birds, which lay eggs in other birds' nests, leaving them to raise the chicks. So, in that sense, I am a cuckold. However, the definition I adhere to involves a wife's infidelity with her husband's consent. I certainly didn't consent to your cheating, and even by the traditional definition, the shame lies with the unfaithful wife, not the husband. So I couldn't care less if people perceive me as a cuckold. What matters is that the children deserve to know the truth. That's just typical of you, Justin. You're willing to sacrifice your children's well-being because your fragile masculinity has been wounded," Amber retorted, her eyes flashing with anger. "Well, I won't be the one to break the news to them," I smirked. "That task falls to you, and I'll be there to witness it. And if you refuse, I'll have no qualms about revealing certain photographs of you and Jimmy in compromising situations. The choice is yours." Of course, I had no such photographs, but Amber was unaware of that fact. She must have been questioning how I obtained them, given the circumstances. The truth was, I hadn't discovered evidence of Amber's affair with Jimmy. Instead, I stumbled upon indications that one of my children might not be biologically mine. My blood type is A positive, while Amber's is O positive. Jennifer shares her mother's blood type, but Todd has a different one, B positive. Given our blood types, Todd couldn't possibly be my biological son. Reluctantly, I sought DNA tests to confirm my suspicions. Amber raised a fuss and threatened to publicly shame me. However, I informed her that I would talk to the kids with or without her, so eventually, we sat down together with them. The next day, we both waited for the kids to return from school. "Kids, come into the kitchen. Your mother and I need to talk to you," I called out as they entered through the front door. Jennifer and Todd looked utterly confused as they sat down, glancing between their mother and me. "Kids, it's difficult to say this," Amber began, nervously twisting a napkin, "but your father and I are getting divorced." The kids reacted strongly, and I had to calm them down. "Let your mother finish, and then we'll talk." "It's no one's fault," Amber tried to continue, but I interrupted her by slamming my palm on the table. "Enough, Amber," I said angrily. "Since you won't be honest, I will. You're old enough to handle it. But first, know that I love you both unconditionally. I don't know how your mother feels about you." "You jerk," Amber retorted. "You know I love our children just as much as you do." "Whatever," I dismissed her, then turned to our kids and saw the fear in their eyes. "Your mother cheated on me, so I'm divorcing her, but there's more you need to know." "You're just being a real jerk about this, Justin," Amber snapped. "This isn't easy for me, and it hurts. But while your mother was cheating, she got pregnant by her lover and had both of you. I'm not your biological father. Jimmy Swanson is." The children remained silent initially, tears streaming down their faces. Witnessing their pain struck me deeply. However, I understood that it was better for them to hear the truth from us, rather than succumb to the inevitable gossip that would circulate through the town. "Why, Mom?" Jennifer choked out amid her tears. "Why would you betray Dad? Betray us?" Amber shot me a hostile glance before addressing her daughter. "Because I love Jimmy Swanson." "Let's reveal the whole truth now," I interjected, my disdain for Amber evident. "Your mother stands to inherit $7 million when she turns 35, as long as she remains married, which she will. She couldn't marry Jimmy before because your grandparents disapproved of him. According to the terms of the trust, if she defied her parents' wishes and married him, she would have lost her inheritance." Todd was now weeping while Jennifer had risen from her seat and positioned herself in front of her mother. "You did all of this for money. You tore us apart for money. For money." Jennifer advanced and delivered a resounding slap to her mother. Then she lunged further, causing Amber to fall to the floor. In an instant, Jennifer was upon her mother, delivering hard slaps and punches. I had anticipated a challenging conversation, but violence was beyond my expectations. It took all my strength to restrain my daughter, who weighed only 100 pounds. Once I had Jennifer under control, I escorted her to the living room and instructed her to sit on the couch. Returning to check on Amber, I found her slowly getting up, blood dripping from her nose and lip. "I hope you're satisfied with yourself, Justin," Amber spat angrily. "You've truly messed up our children. Don't you dare blame my dad for this mess, you wretched woman." Jennifer screamed, charging back into the kitchen. "If you utter one more derogatory word about Daddy, I'll gouge your eyes out." Amber recoiled from her daughter, clearly taken aback and somewhat frightened. "Amber, I believe it would be best for you to find somewhere else to stay for a few days," I suggested, attempting to maintain a sense of calm and reason. "At least until emotions have a chance to settle." Amber, though unhappy, proceeded to pack a bag. Before leaving, she popped her head back into the kitchen. "Don't worry, kids, I still care about you." If glares could kill, Jennifer's stare would have been lethal. Amber sensed she was pushing her luck and departed. It took hours to soothe the kids, with Todd still in tears at bedtime, leaving Jennifer terrified. "Will you still be our dad?" Jennifer asked as we sat in the kitchen. "I'd be devastated if I lost you." "You'll be 18 soon," I replied. "Then you can choose. Legally, I might not have parental rights, but know this. You'll always be my daughter, and I'll always love you." Jennifer managed a brave smile before I kissed her goodnight and went to Todd's room. Though he'd stopped crying, he looked utterly miserable. None of us slept well that night. I doubted my decision to confront the kids, but I couldn't see a better way. They've always been closer to me than their mother, especially Jennifer, my little princess, and Todd, who shared many interests with me. As I lay there, another realization struck me. Amber's trips to visit her sisters were likely excuses to see Jimmy. Following my confrontation with Amber, she and Jimmy opted to make their relationship public. Amber refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, instead blaming others for her actions. She held her grandparents responsible for the trust's restrictive conditions, her parents for their disapproval of Jimmy, and me for not fulfilling my role as a proper husband. Rumors circulated that Amber portrayed me as distant and unloving, justifying her turn to Jimmy. Though she never mentioned the paternity of our children, many of our friends viewed her with skepticism. Upon hearing these accounts, my anger intensified, driving me to seek revenge against both Amber and Jimmy. It's perhaps a primal instinct, particularly for a man, to retaliate against a cheating spouse and their paramour. However, upon reflection, I realized my desire for revenge was primarily directed at Amber. Jimmy was merely a regular guy, not the orchestrator of this betrayal. I felt the urge to disclose to everyone that I wasn't biologically related to Jennifer and Todd, but I refrained from doing so out of concern for my children. Despite the circumstances, I regarded them as my own. As time passed, I sank into a profound depression, my world crumbling around me. My job and the children were the only things keeping me together. Following the tumultuous encounter between Amber and the kids, they remained with me, providing a beacon of light in my life. Throughout the divorce proceedings, Amber wisely avoided pressing the issue, though she attempted to reconnect with Jennifer and Todd. After several attempts, Amber ceased trying to reach her daughter. Jennifer harbored immense bitterness toward her mother, resulting in their conversations devolving into heated arguments filled with profanity. Conversely, Todd maintained contact with his mother, but felt despondent afterward. Jennifer struggled to manage her anger toward her mother and Jimmy, while Todd grappled with the aftermath of our breakup. Ultimately, I realized that all three of us needed professional assistance. I arranged meetings for the three of us with a family counselor named Mary Chaser. Mary requested to meet with all of us collectively and individually. Additionally, she insisted on Amber's presence in the sessions, to which Amber surprisingly agreed. However, the initial group meeting turned out to be a significant mistake. I had to physically restrain Jennifer when Amber casually remarked that the children simply needed to move on. Following that incident, I informed Mary that if Amber was to continue attending future sessions, we would not be participating. Mary concurred that it would be prudent to exclude Amber at that point. Subsequently, a frightening notion plagued my mind. What if the court decided to take the children away from me and deny me visitation rights? For weeks, I was tormented by the possibility of never seeing them again, which exacerbated my depression. Mary eventually prescribed antidepressants, which provided some relief. Initially, the counseling session seemed ineffective, but over time I experienced slight improvement. Despite my lingering desire for retribution against Amber and Jimmy, I had to suppress it, as Mary warned that any rash actions could result in the court severing my ties with the children. The final divorce hearing was chaotic. The judge was displeased with Amber upon reviewing the petition. Amber's attorney was uncooperative, and my own attorney appeared more focused on outdoing his counterpart than on representing me. However, it was Jennifer who delivered a critical blow, with the judge delivering the other. The entire ordeal laid bare Amber's selfish and callous nature. Despite inheriting access to her trust, which had amassed nearly $10 million, she demanded a significant portion from me, including half of the marital assets, the house, alimony, and half of my $401K. My lawyer did a fairly good job explaining the deceitful actions of Amber towards me. He then attempted to portray me as a nearly saintly husband and father. After a brief period, the judge instructed him to proceed. However, his final plea on my behalf was articulate and heartfelt. He urged the court not to condone Amber's deception. The topic of custody then arose. Naturally, Amber sought full custody of the children with limited visitation rights for me. I was certain that Amber aimed to strip me of all rights, blaming me for the strained relationship with the kids. However, I also believed her attorney cautioned against such extreme measures, knowing the court's likely disapproval. On my part, I desired full custody with generous visitation rights for Amber. My lawyer cautioned that my hopes were unrealistic in the eyes of the court. Before delving into custody matters, the judge asked if the children preferred to speak privately in chambers. Jennifer promptly declined, asserting her preference for her statements to be on record. Todd echoed her sentiment. Jennifer, despite her visible fear, boldly approached the lectern and directed a loving message to me, despite her tense relationship with her mother. Then, addressing Amber, she expressed her disavowal of her as a mother, declaring her intention to sever ties upon turning 18. Amber's outburst was swiftly reprimanded by the judge, who reminded her that her attorney had already presented her case and emphasized the importance of hearing from the children without interruption. Amber's complexion turned crimson, leaving me unsure whether it stemmed from embarrassment or anger. Nevertheless, I shifted my focus back to my daughter as she continued. At 5, I eagerly crafted a picture for you, awaiting your return all day. Yet when I presented it to you, You merely patted my head, criticizing my coloring skills. Later, I discovered the artwork discarded in the trash. Jennifer's face flushed, her breaths deepening, but she persisted. At 9, when the carnival arrived, Dad promised we'd all go together. Todd and I were thrilled. Only for you to cancel last minute, presumably for your lover. Dad took us instead, and despite enjoying ourselves, it stung that you chose not to spend time with me. Then at 12, facing my first period while you were away, Dad comforted and educated me. He reassured me and even took me to buy supplies. When you returned, you handed me what I needed and a book about female anatomy, offering no further support. Dad was more of a mother figure than you ever were, and those are just a few examples of your neglect. Jennifer paused, brushing away a tear from her cheek, and cast another piercing gaze at her mother. Your actions toward my father were heartless, calculated, and utterly self-serving. What you've done to a man who only sought to love you has wounded me deeply. Your treatment of Todd and me is beyond forgiveness. I hold you in the lowest regard. Her attention then shifted to Jimmy. And as for you, Mr. Swanson, while you may have provided the biological material for Todd and me, I value this speck of earth more than I do you. Turning to face the judge, Jennifer continued, if you compel me to reside with her, I can assure you there will be unrest. To prevent that, with the assistance of my grandfather's lawyer, I filed a petition for emancipation. I wish to sever all legal ties with that woman. The judge was taken aback by Jennifer's declaration, but accepted the petition and added it to his stack of documents. Todd, visibly anxious, took the floor as the next speaker. Despite his discomfort with public speaking, he recognized the necessity of voicing his perspective. I'm really nervous, he stuttered. Speaking in public isn't my forte. I have just as many stories as Jen about my mother's neglect, but I don't want to waste anyone's time. I simply want to express that I refuse to live with that woman and that person. Todd paused, his cheeks flushing crimson. Oh, I apologize. I didn't mean to use that term. Even though it accurately reflects my feelings, I can barely stand to look at her without feeling utterly repulsed. I want to stay with the only father figure I've ever known. Please, don't force me to go and live with them. Todd gestured towards his mother and Jimmy before retreating to his seat. I observed Amber and Jimmy during the children's presentations. Amber's face had turned even redder, and she was trembling. On the other hand, Jimmy only displayed a slight hint of anger when Todd insulted him. Despite being generally easygoing, Jimmy clearly resented Todd's disparaging remarks. Amber seemed thoroughly displeased with her children, and I was certain she would hold me responsible. But I didn't mind, as I agreed with everything the children had said. It was evident that Amber had been far from an exemplary mother, and now everyone knew why. After the kids finished, I anticipated the judge would adjourn to deliberate his ruling, but he didn't. Typically, I take a few days to consider both sides' arguments before making a decision. However, this case is so clear-cut that I see only one possible ruling. Firstly, this marriage was entered into under fraudulent pretenses, hence I am annulling it. It will be as though the marriage never existed. I'm uncertain about the impact this will have on your trust. I suspect nothing will change since your parents were the sole beneficiaries. Nevertheless, someone might contest your entitlement to the trust, and you'll need to defend yourself. Amber's complexion swiftly shifted from a vivid red to a stark pallor. She appeared unsteady in her seat until Jimmy steadied her by pulling her close. The judge observed Amber momentarily before proceeding. As there was no marriage, there are no shared marital assets in the conventional sense. Each of you will retain what you brought into the relationship, except for the house and Mrs. Williams' car. Despite Mr. Williams evidently covering the expenses for the car, it is registered under her name and will remain her property. The house is jointly owned. Thus, I decree that the proceeds will be divided upon its sale. Upon reviewing the evidence, it's apparent that Mr. Williams contributed approximately 90% towards expenses during your time together. Hence, I rule that all investments be divided in a 90-to-10 ratio, unless Mrs. Swanson can substantiate a contribution exceeding 10%. I glanced at Amber and saw a thoroughly infuriated woman. Clearly, this court hearing wasn't unfolding as she had anticipated. Personally, I was pleasantly surprised by the proceedings. I had heard countless horror stories of husbands being mistreated by the courts. However, everything changed when the judge declared that there had never been a marriage between us, and I wasn't legally tied to Amber. Now, regarding custody, the judge began. I understand that Jennifer and Todd are deeply affected, so I must take that into consideration. In a typical divorce scenario, Jennifer would be of an age to express her preference for residence. However, since Mr. Williams is not the biological father, and the marriage has been annulled, I cannot award him custody. Nonetheless, as Jennifer has already petitioned for emancipation from her mother, I will permit her to reside with her grandparents if they are willing to take her in. She will be under their supervision until a decision is reached on the emancipation request. Ultimately, in approximately a year, she will have the autonomy to decide her place of residence. A brief glance in Amber's direction caught me off guard. A solitary tear traced its path down her cheek. Amber and Jennifer had never seen eye to eye, particularly over the past 5 years. I chalked it up to Jennifer's rebellious teenage phase, reminiscent of the clashes my sister and mother experienced during her high school years. However, unlike my family, Amber and Jennifer's relationship seemed doomed. Amber's betrayal severed any ties with her daughter, at least for the foreseeable future. As for Todd Williams' custody, the judge remarked with a frown, I understand his strong preference to reside with Mr. Williams due to his grievances with his mother. Yet Mr. Williams has no legal standing in this custody decision. Hence, custody is awarded to Mrs. Williams with a recommendation for generous visitation rights for Mr. Williams. However, I cannot enforce this recommendation. Since Todd will be under his mother's care, Mrs. Williams may remain in the family home. Yet beyond your obligation to the bank, Mr. Williams, I cannot mandate mortgage payments. The judge scanned the room swiftly. If there are no further matters, this court is adjourned. Todd rose abruptly, knocking over his chair in the process, and stormed out, tears streaming. Amber stood, shooting me a glare, while Jennifer approached, embracing me. I gave Jennifer a peck on the cheek and mentioned that I'd treat her and Todd to lunch if Amber agreed to let Todd join us. Later, I discussed with my lawyer the possibility of overturning the judge's decision regarding the house, but he advised against it. It seemed I'd have to persuade Amber to pay her share, or else I'd cover the payments myself to safeguard the equity. My lawyer also mentioned that I could seek reimbursement for payments exceeding 50% upon the house's sale. While in the hallway, I overheard Todd arguing with Amber and Jimmy. I intervened, asking Todd to calm down and wait outside, which he reluctantly did. Amber then directed her anger towards me. You may think you've won. She jabbed a finger into my chest. But I have the house and the love of my life. Despite thinking Amber couldn't hurt me further, her words stung. I fought the urge to retaliate physically and kept a composed smile. Would it be acceptable for Todd to join Jennifer and me for lunch? I asked politely. Go to hell, she spat. No, Todd won't be anywhere near you today or ever. I won't let you poison him like you did to my daughter. If you honestly believe that, then you're incredibly foolish, I retorted, struggling to maintain my composure. Watch your language, Jimmy warned me. Jimmy, lay a hand on me, and I'll make you regret it. I warned, my restraint wearing thin. Jimmy noticed the expression in my eyes and chose not to press further. Once I was certain he wouldn't pose a problem, I redirected my attention to my former partner, who never officially became my wife. I resolved to take a more assertive approach. Amber, you are undeniably one of the most self-centered individuals I've encountered. Allow me to enlighten you on a few matters. Firstly, you do not possess some sort of invaluable allure. Our intimacy was far from satisfying, yet you received all you desired from your casual partner. Moreover, if given the chance to rewind time, knowing what I know now, I would still choose to have the same children despite being stuck in a package deal with you. My priority has always been our kids, so I bid you farewell. I wish you a life filled with misery and despair." Upon concluding, I felt drained, so I needed to leave before losing control completely. I turned and made my way out. Amber's insults followed me, labeling me a pitiful failure. She ranted about my inadequacy compared to Jimmy and expressed disgust at the thought of intimacy with me. Todd didn't take the news of his mother declining lunch with us well. I apologized and explained that legal constraints bound my actions. He burst into tears, pleading to accompany me. At that moment, I didn't think I could feel any worse, but I was mistaken. I embraced him and assured him he had to stay with his mother, promising to relentlessly pursue bringing him back to me. The following half-year marked the lowest point in my life. I was consumed by feelings of anger, rage, sorrow, and profound despair. Amber contested the judge's ruling on asset division, prompting me to file a lawsuit on behalf of the children to challenge the trust she had obtained. I argued that as our marriage was annulled, Amber hadn't met the trust's requirements. Yet, I lost both cases. The appeals court determined that despite being deceived into marrying Amber and having our marriage annulled, her contribution to the household was deemed significant, awarding her 40% of our shared assets, excluding my 401k. Regarding the trust, the court ruled that Jennifer and Todd lacked standing as they weren't mentioned in it. They emphasize that since I was never legally married to Amber, I had no standing either. The court recognized only the trustees appointed by Amber's deceased grandparents, with Amber now serving as the sole trustee. Furthermore, they viewed our cohabitation as a form of common law marriage. As devastating as the court defeats were, what frustrated me the most was my inability to seek any form of revenge against Amber or Jimmy. Seeing them together in public, behaving like infatuated teenagers, only intensified my anguish. Their constant presence wherever I went reignited the emotional turmoil. Unable to endure it any longer, I relocated to a town 15 miles away. Fortunately, due to school district boundaries, Jennifer didn't have to change schools while Todd remained with Amber, unaffected by the move. I attempted to suppress it and leave Amber in the past, but I couldn't shake the torment. The same haunting dream plagued me repeatedly. Jimmy with Amber, his smirk aimed at me, taunting me with the words, "Watch as I impregnate your wife." Sleep eluded me, and my appetite suffered. Amidst those bleak 6 months, Todd emerged as a bright spot. His incessant demands finally drove Amber to call me to take him off her hands. It was a rare moment of levity amidst the darkness. As Todd dashed out of the old house with his belongings, Amber and Jimmy appeared on the porch to bid farewell. Unexpectedly, tears streamed down Amber's face, while Jimmy looked relieved. As Todd made his way to my car, Amber professed, "I love you." Todd didn't pause but flipped his mother and Jimmy the bird. Amber broke into uncontrollable sobs. I won't apologize for feeling a sense of satisfaction. Yet, when Jimmy embraced Amber tightly, my satisfaction turned to fury. I restrained myself, returning to the car to take Todd to my place. I arranged for him to remain in his current school until the year's end. In my rented 3-bedroom house, Jennifer and Todd's presence was my anchor, preventing me from descending into madness. My desire for revenge against the adulterers consumed me, but any plan I devised seemed destined to land me in jail. Still, there were moments when I entertained the idea of screw it, resorting to violence despite the consequences. Yet the thought of my children's well-being banished such notions from my mind. My children offered me unwavering support, and I made every effort to regain control of my life. I was aware that Jennifer and Todd were deeply concerned about my declining health. Eventually, Jennifer stepped in significantly, taking charge of household responsibilities. She cooked, cleaned, ensured Todd attended school, and completed his homework. Additionally, Jennifer made sure I ate properly and went to work. 9 months after the annulment, everything reached a breaking point. I experienced a severe panic attack while at work, causing me to collapse and struggle to breathe. Many thought it was a heart attack, and I was rushed to the hospital for extensive tests. Upon diagnosis of a severe panic attack, I was referred to a therapist. Initially hesitant, I was compelled to attend sessions by my father, who warned of potential consequences involving my children. My therapist, Ann Summers, proved to be immensely helpful. She explained that I was suffering from PTSD, akin to someone who had experienced combat or profound loss. Ms. Summers outlined the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, and clarified that I was stuck between anger and depression, without the opportunity for negotiation. My panic attack served as a warning sign of the detrimental impact of stress on my health. Ms. Summers emphasized that if I allowed things to persist, it would eventually lead to my demise. While I couldn't dispute Ann's evaluation, I lacked the insight to enact any change. Luckily, she provided guidance. I was tasked with maintaining a journal documenting every negative thought I harbored towards Amber and Jimmy. At the conclusion of each entry, I was to inscribe, "I forgive them." During our sessions, I had to confront my darkest musings about my former spouse, and we'd dissect them together. One particularly disturbing notion involved a violent act towards Jimmy. After deliberation, I acknowledged that I couldn't live with the guilt of harming another person, even him, and then prompted me to consider the impact on our children if I were to carry out such actions. I conceded that their respect for me would likely diminish. Thus, the theme persisted with each hateful thought: the welfare of the children. Gradually, I relinquished much of my animosity, leading to improvements in my life. Around the same time as I underwent therapy, I recognized Jennifer's own struggles with hatred. She exhibited hostility towards almost everyone, except Todd and me. Even her interactions with her grandfather sometimes turned sour. Eventually, my father encouraged me to seek counseling for the children, a step I promptly took. While Jennifer and Todd attended their therapy sessions, I was informed respectfully that they were confidential. Jennifer never divulged her discussions with the therapist, whereas Todd freely shared his experiences. He confided in me about the deep-seated resentment he held towards his mother, feeling abandoned and betrayed, particularly by her. Despite Todd's anger towards his mother, he revealed that Jennifer's fury eclipsed his own by a significant margin. Though inexplicable, this revelation left me profoundly saddened. 2 years post-divorce, Todd finally engaged in conversations with his mother, albeit they were far from affectionate. Despite their cool exchanges, Amber cherished even this minimal contact, yearning for more. Conversely, Jennifer adamantly refused any communication or involvement with her mother. Approximately 4 years later, Jennifer tied the knot. I attempted to persuade her to include her mother and Jimmy in the celebration, but Jennifer staunchly declined. I expressed concern about her harboring so much resentment. In response, Jennifer smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and said, "I'm not angry anymore, Dad." People often mistake hate for the opposite of love, but it's not. Indifference is. I feel entirely indifferent toward her. I simply don't care about her actions, words, or thoughts. She disregarded me and betrayed our family. Initially, I was angry, but now I'm apathetic. She's someone I prefer not to associate with. Having her at my wedding would taint the day, so neither of them is invited. After being betrayed by Amber, I thought I'd never remarry. However, a year before Jennifer's wedding, I decided to wed Jane Wilder, who had been pushing for it after over a year of dating. She made it clear she wanted a family, so I had to decide. I chose Jean, and it was the best decision of my life. Our wedding felt like a fresh start, finally laying to rest the demons of my past marriage. Naturally, neither Jimmy nor Amber received invitations to the wedding. The following 3 years were favorable. Jennifer welcomed a son, Justin, and 18 months later, a daughter named Christina. She refused to let Amber visit her in the hospital, and they were not invited to the christenings. Moreover, Amber was excluded from birthday celebrations and holidays. Jennifer had completely cut Amber out of her life. In the ensuing years, I rarely saw Amber or Jimmy. If I did encounter them, it no longer triggered an emotional reaction in me. I had become like Jennifer. I felt indifferent towards Amber. However, Amber unexpectedly reached out to me, wanting to discuss the children. Though uncomfortable, I believed it was necessary. Approaching Amber's table, she looked at me hopefully. I nodded and took a seat opposite her. "You're looking well, Amber," I said amiably. "Where's Jimmy?" Amber's cheeks flushed slightly. "We're taking a break from each other." "I'm sorry to hear that," I replied, though I didn't genuinely feel sorry. I already knew about Jimmy and his departure. While I wasn't certain, I suspected Jimmy had become complacent when my ex-wife inherited her fortune. However, Amber grew tired of his dependency and urged him to find employment, which he opposed. Whether Jimmy would return was of no concern to me. I simply wanted to conclude our meeting. "What did you want to discuss?" I inquired. "I heard you got married and are expecting," she said with a half smile. "Congratulations, now you'll have a child of your own." "I'll have 3 children," I retorted, feeling the surge of anger. Amber acknowledged her significant error, expressing remorse for her thoughtlessness and clarifying her true intentions. She conveyed her happiness for the expectant parents' joy. My tension eased as I accepted her apology and inquired about the topic she wished to discuss further. Expressing distress, Amber revealed her anguish over Jennifer's refusal to communicate or allow her involvement in the lives of her grandchildren. Despite her longing to be a part of their lives, Jennifer remained distant. Though tempted to blame Amber's past actions for the current situation, I opted for restraint and chose a more compassionate approach. I asked what specific action she wanted me to take. Desperately, Amber appealed to my influence with Jennifer, believing she would heed my words. I explained that I had already attempted to intervene on her behalf, advocating for her inclusion in various family events. However, Jennifer remained steadfast in her refusal, even threatening to boycott gatherings if Amber was invited. Overwhelmed with despair, Amber questioned if Jennifer harbored such intense animosity towards her. I assured her that Jennifer didn't hate her, but rather felt neglected during her upbringing and subsequently chose to distance herself. Despite my efforts to persuade Jennifer otherwise, she remained resolute in her decision. Amber's tears fell silently, and I gently squeezed her hand. "I'll keep making an effort. Perhaps one day Jennifer will soften." "I've made such a mess, Justin," she confessed, tears streaming down her face. "I was selfish and cruel. I'm truly sorry. I know it might not mean much now, but I genuinely apologize." Leaving Amber crying in the booth, I walked to my car where my wife, Jen, awaited, her face curious. "So, what did your never-wife want?" she inquired. "Just what you'd expect," I replied sadly. "Amber wants me to help her reconcile with Jennifer." "Isn't it said that we're the result of our life choices?" Jean pondered. "Yeah, it's true." I nodded. Yet despite everything Amber put me through, I can't help but pity her. Driving home, I realized all the time spent plotting revenge against Amber was futile. She had created her own misery and was trapped in it every day.